President.
I recognize the senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise today in opposition to a widely irresponsible legislation that is before us now. Although our colleagues are calling it the big, beautiful bill, this bill would instead be a betrayal to our economic future, hardworking American families, and some of our most vulnerable seniors, children, and people with disabilities. This bill will blow up our national debt, kick millions of people off of their health care, and take food off of families' tables while cutting food assistance. And for what? What our colleagues are mortgaging our country's future for? What are they slashing health care and food assistance to pay for? Well, they're doing it for tax cuts for billionaires. So before my colleagues rush to pass this irresponsible, reckless legislation, let's take a moment to go through exactly how much harm this bill will actually cause and hear from the people in my state who are going to suffer if this law becomes law.
Meet Rapid Radios, the only push-to-talk walkie-talkies with unlimited. Meet Rapid Radios, the only push-to-talk walkie-talkies with unlimited nationwide range and zero contracts. Most radios charge $40 per month per device. Not us. Ours are just $50 per year, and within limited range, they're perfect for families, preppers, road trippers, and businesses. These bad boys are super simple to use. There's no complicated setup needed. Just turn them on and start talking. They offer unlimited nationwide range, 5-day battery life, and there's no monthly fees ever. It's why we're the trusted device for Fortune 500 companies, police departments, and even Fox Sports Radio. Hurricanes, wildfires, power outages, Rapid Radios keeps you connected when it matters most. Over 130,000 people across the United States have already made the switch, and the big guys are sweating. So get yours today before the next emergency hits. Click below to get 60% off plus free shipping.
Financial milestones that we face. Within the next decade, our country will spend more on servicing the debt than we do on any other federal account outside of Social Security. Our fiscal house is basically on fire. But if our Republican colleagues jam through this bill, it's not going to pour water on that fire, it's going to pour gasoline on those flames. Democrats have tried to make efforts to pay down that debt in recent years. In fact, under the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that this bill attempts to actually gut, we reduced the deficit in that bill by nearly $250 billion. And in 2023, we passed the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act, which responsibly addressed the debt ceiling and had the potential to reduce deficits by up to $1.5 trillion. But unfortunately, the bill before us basically wipes all of that away. And I have always said that I'm open to making smart cuts to spending, but that those cuts should be matched with increases in revenues. Doing so would put us back on a sustainable financial path. Our Republican colleagues are doing the exact opposite. They are making drastic cuts to revenue, and according to the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, the tax provisions in this bill alone would decrease revenues by $4.2 trillion and add $3 trillion to our national debt. This is a recipe for disaster. If we face another emergency, like a pandemic or global financial crisis, we will be too hamstrung by our debt to respond effectively. We are on the brink of a financial disaster, and passing this bill could push us over that edge. Also, my Republican colleagues can cut taxes for billionaires. At the same time, our Republican colleagues are not making smart, sensible spending cuts to cover the costs that these billionaire tax cuts will mean. Instead, they're gutting health care for millions of Americans, including hundreds of thousands of Michiganders. It's reckless and it is wrong. Medicaid is a lifeline for people in every single community across this country. It ensures that millions of Michiganders and Americans can have access to quality, affordable health care. And right now, folks across my home state of Michigan are scared. Scared about what this bill will mean for their families. I've heard from thousands of my constituents from every corner of the state of Michigan on how these cuts are going to hurt them. So today, I just want to tell you, through my constituent stories, just how detrimental this bill will be for most Americans. Take Isaac from Lansing, for example, who says Medicaid is the only lifeline he has to pay for the medicine that literally keeps him alive. We've also seen how more and more Michiganders and people all across our nation have shouldered the burden of serving as a primary caregiver for an aging parent. It's the ultimate gift that we can give to the people who have raised us. But the cost of critical nursing home and assisted living care continues to rise. Medicaid has become an essential way for our aging seniors to pay for the care that they need. Take Gwen from Grand Rapids, who says she wouldn't be able to pay for an assisted living facility for her grandmother without Medicaid. Many of us know someone, or maybe even love someone, who lives with a disability. Thanks to Medicaid, people with disabilities can get the care that allows them to live healthy and independent lives. That is the case for Wanda from Westland, who takes medication for an eye condition. Without Medicaid, she would not be able to afford her medication, and she could actually go blind. As too many of us know from personal experiences or from friends and loved ones, our country is facing a mental health crisis. Medicaid has become a saving grace for those who desperately need mental health care, but simply cannot afford it. Take Alan from Fort Gratiot, who says losing Medicaid would feel like losing the lives he's been given back through mental health care from Medicaid. Under this bill, rural communities will be especially impacted by cuts to Medicaid. In some counties in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there's only one health care provider, meaning some Michiganders will have to travel up to 50 miles to get routine or emergency care. Medicaid helps keep these hospitals open. And if this bill passes, people in these rural communities are going to be cut off from basic health services. Medicaid also plays an essential role in making sure that children across Michigan get the care that they need. I heard from Gladys, a mother from Flint, who says Medicaid is the only reason her kids can get their asthma medication or have regular health checkups. Expecting mothers also reached out to share their concerns. While she is busy preparing to welcome a newborn baby into the world, Chelsea from Fenville is now afraid that she will lose her access to both pre- and post-natal care under this absolutely disastrous bill. I simply can't understand how my Republican colleagues would leave thousands of people across Michigan without the care that they need, all so they can give a tax break to billionaires. On top of that, my Republican colleagues are also proposing deep, harmful cuts to food assistance delivered through SNAP. SNAP serves as an absolute lifeline for millions of Americans, including children, seniors, people with disabilities, and working families. So simply put, if this bill is passed, it will mean people in Michigan and all across our country will go hungry. They will not be able to put food on the table while billionaires pay less taxes. That is just wrong. But it also makes no economic sense either. Every dollar in SNAP benefits generates more than $1.50 in economic activity. This supports local grocery stores, farmers all across our country, and the entire food supply chain. So on top of jeopardizing families' ability to put food on the table, to feed their children, these proposed SNAP cuts would also hurt businesses and jobs, particularly in rural America, and in low-income areas. This bill produces the most amount of pain for the least amount of gain of any legislation that I can remember in all the years that I've had the privilege of serving here in the Senate. Mr. President, I can't believe that we are standing here debating this reckless, irresponsible bill. The harm this bill will do to the American people and to the people in my state of Michigan who are counting on Medicaid for health care and on food assistance to help feed their families is absolutely reprehensible. The damage this bill will do to our nation's economic security is not only reckless, it is unconscionable. This is not what our constituents want us to be focused on. They want us to help make their life better. But instead of focusing on that, here we are on the brink of passing a bill so irresponsible that it will destroy our country's economic health, harm millions of Americans, all so a handful of billionaires, the wealthiest of the wealthy, can have another tax break. Mr. President, I will never support such a reckless and catastrophic plan. Mr. President, I yield the floor. No, this is.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. You get to be here for my second speech. I'm here to talk now about the centerpiece of this reconciliation bill, making the 2017 tax cuts permanent. The One Big Beautiful Bill prevents the largest tax hike in history and provides groundbreaking new tax relief for middle-class workers and families. This legislation permanently extends the Trump tax cuts, which proportionally benefited the middle class the most. If these tax cuts were allowed to expire, taxpayers in all income groups would see massive tax hikes. And a point that my colleagues on the other side seem to consistently forget or ignore is that the vast majority of them, $2.6 trillion worth of those tax cuts or tax increases, would fall on taxpayers making less than $400,000 per year. And the vast majority of that is on taxpayers making and earning in the middle and lower middle income categories. No. But before I go on to discuss what would happen, I want to address an issue that is just a constant theme on the other side, and that is that this bill is going to be a huge increase in the deficit. Now here's a quick handwritten chart that my colleague from South Carolina made quickly to respond to them. You heard the previous speaker say that CBO has scored this bill to have a huge multi-trillion-dollar deficit increase. The fact is that CBO has scored this bill to have a $507 billion deficit reduction. You heard that right, a $507 billion deficit reduction. And later on in my remarks, I will point out that that score doesn't even take into account the growth in the economy and the revenue that will come to our Treasury from revitalizing and giving a boost to our economy. So now let's go to the next chart. What will happen if we don't do this? What will happen if we do what the Democrats are demanding that we do? And that is to let this tax increase happen so that they can say they're going to use it to pay the deficit down. The average family of four would see a tax hike of $1,700, and their child tax credit would be cut in half. 20 million small business owners would face massive tax hikes, with some of them facing rates as high as 43%. The standard deduction, which simplifies tax filing for 90% of Americans, would be cut in half. Small businesses and farms would see their death exemption cut in half. The Council of Economic Advisors warns us that this $4 trillion tax hike would also lead to an economic downturn and potential recessionary headwinds, noting that the impacts would disproportionately fall on young people, minorities, and workers without college degrees. We've been working for more than a year on legislation that prevents that outcome and provides an opportunity for us to have additional tax relief that is specifically targeted to benefit low and middle income families and workers. Despite the rhetoric of fear, our critics' rhetoric about tax cut as being for billionaires and corporations, the reality of this legislation prevents a massive tax hike across the board and overwhelmingly benefits middle-class households and job creators. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, this bill provides more than $600 billion, that's $600 billion more of new tax relief for hardworking Americans. How does it do that? $73 billion in inflation tax relief targeted at income brackets below $100,000 per year. $205 billion in tax relief to the 90% of taxpayers who claim the standard deduction. $93 billion in additional tax relief for seniors through a $6,000 bonus exemption. $124 billion investment in children of low and middle income families, in addition to the permanent doubled child tax credit. I'm going to say that again. The permanent doubled child tax credit. The significant tax relief we are providing to hardworking families includes permanent lower tax rates, letting Americans keep more of their hard-earned money, permanent increased and enhanced standard deduction, claimed by over 90% of taxpayers. On top of making that doubled child tax credit permanent, we are also increasing it for tens of millions of families. Tax relief for seniors in the form of a $6,000 bonus exemption for low and middle income seniors, slashing their tax burden. No tax on tips for millions of tipped workers like waitresses, barbers, hairstylists, and taxi drivers. No tax on overtime for millions of America's hourly workers who work overtime and keep America running. No tax on auto loan interest for new cars made in the United States, allowing the hardworking families of America to fully deduct auto loan interest on American-made cars. Enhanced 529 education savings accounts, making education expenses more affordable and accessible for families. New Trump savings accounts for newborns and children set up to the age of 18, building financial security for the next generation. We make child care more accessible and affordable for working families by enhancing the Child and Dependent Care Credit and the Dependent Care Assistance Program. The list goes on and on. We extend the paid family and medical leave credit and expand health savings and accounts for health care expenses. We repeal onerous IRS reporting requirements on gig workers, reduce the paperwork burden for small businesses, and much more. And all of this just on the individual side of the code. The business side of the tax code has the potential to generate phenomenal economic growth. When my Republican colleagues and I began talking about how to best extend and enhance the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, We agreed that one of our top priorities was to make it permanent. The reforms we made in 2017, including lower rates for corporations and small business owners, along with the international tax reforms, increased domestic investment, boosted economic growth, and increased take-home pay. A growing economy powered a strong labor market. Workers saw record wage growth, and the unemployment rate fell dramatically to the lowest in 50 years at 3.5%. Corporate inversions, which we used to debate endlessly, or businesses leaving America, became a thing of the past. They literally ended. And America became the place to do business again. Capital formation exploded in the United States. Restoring these critical business provisions and making them permanent is a key to driving additional growth and investment in the United States. For businesses that spur investment and economic activity across the country, this bill makes the 20% small business deduction permanent, enabling job creation and spurring local economic activity. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for domestic research and development, encouraging domestic innovation. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for new capital investments, like machinery and equipment, boosting domestic production. Restores and makes permanent interest deductibility, helping to finance critical domestic investments and keep America globally competitive. It includes full expensing for new factories and factory improvements to accelerate domestic manufacturing. Permanently renews and enhances the Opportunity Zone program, driving $100+ billion of investment to rural and distressed communities. According to the Tax Foundation, permanence for the bill's 4 cost recovery provisions I've just reviewed would more than double the long-run economic effect. The National Association of Manufacturers predicts $248 billion in economic growth will come from the manufacturing sector alone, along with over 1 million jobs and over $100 billion in new wages. The National Federation of Independent Businesses says that making the small business deduction permanent will create 1.2 million jobs over 10 years, growing to 2.4 million jobs in the long run. That growth also means more federal revenue created right along the way. And the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that the tax legislation alone, this tax legislation alone, will drive more than $2 trillion in offsetting deficit reduction, thanks to permanent provisions that power economic growth and incentivize investment. Over a 10-year window, with this legislation in effect, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that debt as a share of GDP will fall to 94%, compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. And this chart is important to look at. This is what happens to our deficit if we pass this tax legislation and grow our economy. And this is what happens if we don't. The red line is what happens if we don't. Over a 10-year window with this legislation in effect, as this chart shows, the estimate is 94% compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. So while my colleagues on the other side complain and complain that we will not let taxes go up, this is what will happen if they do go up. Far from adding to the deficit, this legislation will finally put us on a sound financial footing as we power growth and curb spending. For those who claim that this bill will add over $4 trillion to the deficit, it bears repeating. Preventing a $4 trillion tax hike is not the same as deficit spending. And those who say that we should let a $4 trillion tax hike go into effect to pay down the national debt, every tax increase that Congress has adopted for as long as I can remember was not used to pay down the national debt. It was used to increase spending. And that's exactly what is going to happen if the Democrats have their way and force this tax hike to happen. It was used by Congress to spend more money, not to reduce debt. Extending current tax policy means that tax revenue as a percent of GDP will remain relatively unchanged. We do not have a revenue problem in America. We have a spending problem. That's why we asked JCT to score this legislation under a more realistic scenario using a current policy baseline. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that making the Trump tax cuts permanent, combined with other Trump administration pro-growth policies like regulatory reform and so forth, it will increase federal revenues by more than $4 trillion, far more than offsetting any deficit estimates.
Hey guys, I just found an amazing digital marketing expert on Fiverr.
The company had its most effective campaign yet. The team continues hiring top-rated experts to this day. And Jerry, well, he wondered if his reaction was a bit much. It definitely was. Hire a freelancer today and start your own success story.
The pro-growth tax policy that I've just described, we cut spending by $1.6 trillion. This chart shows how other bills have tried to take a shot at reducing spending in the past. We far exceed any spending reduction bill that Congress has ever passed. We're paying attention to the revenue side, and we're paying attention to the spending side. To achieve this record level of savings, we are slashing President Biden's Green New Deal spending and promoting an America First energy policy. We are eliminating hundreds of billions of dollars of the Green New Deal subsidies, including ending wasteful credits like the EV tax credit. We stop penalizing fossil fuels in favor of unreliable and expensive green energy, and instead support consistent energy sources, making energy affordable again. We are also rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending programs, as my colleague from South Carolina mentioned, like those that we have identified in Medicaid. This will not reduce benefits for those who are qualified and for whom Medicaid was intended. It will reduce waste, fraud, and abusive scams that are being used to get the American taxpayer to funnel money into states or into other programs. This program was created to help pregnant women, children, and seniors in America and those with disabilities. We are continuing to protect them. They will not lose benefits, and the politics of fear that you hear constantly are simply false. But in recent years, the Democrats have incentivized Medicaid to enroll healthy Americans and illegal immigrants, driving up costs for taxpayers and risking the program's sustainability for those who need it the most. This is what has happened. This is what's happening to the enrollment and the spending in Medicaid. The fate of this expansion is an unsustainable path and puts the future of the program at risk, including the United States federal debt. As spending has surged, so have inappropriate payments and ineligible enrollments, along with gimmicks and loopholes. People are alarmed by these statistics, but official reports indicate that the federal government made $543 billion in inappropriate Medicaid payments from 2015 through 2024. Some experts think that that number is closer to $1 trillion. That is what we are addressing in this legislation. We have the responsibility to ensure that programs like Medicaid work efficiently and effectively and remain financially viable for those for whom it was designed to help. For months, my Democrat colleagues have engaged in the politics of fear, warning that Republicans are going to rip this critical program from those most in need. Let me be clear. This legislation does not take Medicaid away from any recipients for whom the program was designed to help. Children, the elderly, the disabled or infirm, adults caring for children, and elderly relatives are protected by this bill. We would not be honoring our obligation to these recipients if we allow the program to continue to balloon, forcing vulnerable populations to compete for available resources with able-bodied adults who refuse to work. As one father recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Medicaid was created to help people like my son. He is 17, has severe autism and epilepsy, and needs constant attention. Yet thanks to Obamacare's Medicaid expansion, he is stuck on a multi-year waiting list for an in-home care because able-bodied adults are competing for the same results. CBO estimates that over 1.4 million illegal aliens are receiving Medicaid benefits. I'm talking about those who are not United States citizens and are not legally in the United States, receiving Medicaid benefits, and pushing those like this man's 17-year-old son out of his opportunity to get access to those benefits. Brett Guthrie, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, correctly notes, every dollar misspent on illegal immigrants and ineligible individuals in the Medicaid program means less money going to our children, our pregnant women and mothers, individuals, and others who are disabled and seniors. Republicans are committed to preserving and strengthening Medicaid for the people Medicaid was intended to serve. That starts with making common sense reforms to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. This bill targets rampant fraud in the program by removing illegal aliens, deceased recipients, or those enrolled in multiple states. It eliminates wasteful spending by ensuring that Medicaid payments align with levels in Medicare and other spending programs, and increases the frequency of eligibility checks. It requires more personal accountability and promotes pathways to work for able-bodied adults. The work requirements proposed in this legislation are simple. Many people are amazed that they're so easy to meet and yet so rigorously opposed. If you are an able-bodied adult without dependents, you can qualify for taxpayer-funded Medicaid by spending 20 hours per week working or participating in work training or going to school or participating in community service or volunteer work. The majority of Americans agree that these rules are responsible guardrails to protect a program that was designed to protect America's most vulnerable Americans. The bill also corrects abusive practices by freezing and reducing provider taxes, a financial gimmick used by states to increase federal spending that they receive. For those concerned about funding for rural hospitals during the transition back to responsible funding levels, the legislation creates a bridge funding system to help stabilize rural hospitals and enhance their long-term financial solvency. And while Democrats claim Republicans are slashing Medicaid spending, the reality is that even with these reforms, Medicaid spending is projected to continue to grow by billions of dollars over the next 10 years. Only in Washington is a smaller increase in spending considered a cut. In reality, these reforms will improve, protect, and preserve Medicaid for the most vulnerable Americans. We've had a very robust debate over how to best deliver on President Trump's agenda, and I'm proud of what we achieved in this legislation. The tax provisions in our bill, from permanent extension of the lower tax rate to the increased child tax credit to the permanent tax relief for businesses, will deliver financial security for American families and grow our economy. The health care provisions will protect and preserve Medicaid for the Americans that the program was designed to serve. And while more work remains, this bill's economic growth, combined with deficit reduction that we have in it, finally puts our country on a much better fiscal trajectory. Speaking of work, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to thank the excellent staff from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Senate Legislative Council for the hard work and countless hours they have put in to get us to this point. Some of them have been working with us on these provisions for years, and we greatly appreciate your partnership in this effort. I ask unanimous consent to have these individuals' names printed in the record. Thank you. I also have to thank my incredible staff who have foregone sleep over the past several months to provide timely, indispensable insight, facts, legislative text, counsel, and so much more. Without them, we would not be at this point and ready to deliver this much needed growth-focused policy for the American people. I ask unanimous consent to have the names of my entire Finance Committee staff printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Even with all that, and all that we accomplish in this legislation, there are dozens of additional good ideas, smart policies, and common sense reforms that we were not able to include today. And I commit to working with my colleagues to advance those goals as well as we move forward. But today's historic legislation is more than a good start and will pay dividends for American families, extending good tax policy, delivering targeted relief, and reining in wasteful spending, as achieved in this bill, is the best way to restore economic prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. I look forward to getting it to the President's desk as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I recognize it. Democrat Whip.
Mr. President, we're here today debating a clumsily assembled package, still a work in progress, that would rip away health care from 16 million American families to give tax breaks to millionaires, billionaires, and our largest corporations. Think about that for a moment. The Republicans have decided that the best avenue to generate revenue that they can then give in tax breaks to wealthy people is to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million Americans. That's going to have a dramatic impact on their lives. If you have ever been a young father with a baby with a serious medical problem and you had no health insurance, you'll never forget it as long as you live. I know, I've been there. The notion of losing your health insurance leaves you as vulnerable as possible in some of the most important moments of your life. And that they would consider this provision to eliminate health insurance coverage for 16 million families is unimaginable and cruel. Let's not act like there is a unified Republican front on this issue. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to be here at this moment, jamming this unpopular bill through this chamber under arbitrary deadlines. One of my colleagues took a look at tax breaks, and you're going to hear them say over and over again, well, the average family, if we don't act, the average family is going to have to pay more in taxes. There's a way around that. If we limit any tax breaks in this bill, in this effort, to people making $400,000 a year or less, $400,000 a year or less, it virtually eliminates 2/3 of the cost of this undertaking. And it means you don't have to take away the health insurance of 16 million families. So there are ways to do tax breaks which make sense. Count this Democrat in with the Republicans for helping working families who are struggling to get by, and a lot of them are, living paycheck to paycheck. And the notion that we would say to them, we're going to take away your health insurance, we're going to raise the cost of health insurance for you, is no answer to their problems. Behind closed doors, my Republican colleagues continue to be consumed with infighting, bickering over the bill's substance, and for good reason. We have a process here which is almost impossible to explain to an ordinary person of how we reach reconciliation. The parliamentarian's office, and she's sitting here, God bless you for what you've been through for the last several months, and all your staff, have to make decisions on a daily basis over and over again as to whether or not provisions of this bill are eligible under the law that governs the United States Senate. We're in the process of debating this on the Senate floor. I see our ranking member on the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, the senator from Oregon. We're in the process of still appealing to the parliamentarian's office on provisions in the bill. This is truly a work in progress. I think what they do know is troubling, and it should be. This bill would be a disaster for hospitals. The Senate Republican bill, unfortunately, is going to endanger hospitals all over the United States. But if you happen to live in a small town, rural area, and I represent a lot of them in the state of Illinois, you're the most vulnerable. You are the target. When they cut back on Medicaid programs, these are the hospitals that will close their doors. What's the impact of a hospital closing its door in a downstate community in Illinois? Devastating. Hospitals are not only the center for emergency medical care, good doctors, nurses, and such, they are also a major economic force in small-town America. Take away a hospital and then try to attract a new business to your community. Good luck. This Senate bill cripples one of the main ways that states fund their Medicaid programs and keep hospitals afloat, especially rural and low-income areas. It's called the provider tax. Earlier this week, a Republican senator, circulated a flyer to his fellow caucus members, so they're all on notice, detailing just how much each state will lose in Medicaid provider tax funding under their proposal. Let's take a look at my neck of the woods, the Midwest. Iowa would lose $4.1 billion. Missouri, $6.1 billion. Kentucky, $12 billion. Louisiana would lose $20 billion. North Carolina, $38.9 billion. Senator Tillis and I were in conversation yesterday, and he used that very same figure. His analysis says that to go forward with this bill cuts Medicaid reimbursement in his home state of North Carolina by a whopping $38.9 billion. This list of states and what they will lose was passed around by a Republican senator to his own caucus. They know what they're up against here. If Republicans have their way and pass this bill, hospitals will be forced to shrink or eliminate services. In Decatur, Illinois, one of the major hospitals facing the crunch time had to make a decision whether they keep their doors open. They did, but they eliminated OBGYN, delivering babies, and they eliminated all mental health and addiction counseling, two critical areas for the hospitals. So these doctors, this bill will force hospitals to shrink or eliminate services. Doctors and nurses will leave, and in some cases, the hospital will close. Imagine that in a rural area, a remote area, an extra 45 minutes, an extra hour in the car with somebody in the front seat you love very much who's in a desperate situation. As it stands today, half of the rural hospitals around the country already operate in a danger zone. And it's the same thing for children's hospitals. Do you have one in your community that you've used? I do. These children's hospitals have warned us they can't keep their doors open if Medicaid is cut as dramatically as the Republicans want to cut it. If Republicans have their way, we're going to see massive layoffs, fewer nurses, technicians, and doctors, along with decreasing quality of care. The American Hospital Association has estimated how these cuts to Medicaid could impact not just jobs at red state hospitals, but across the entire economy. Here's what they found. If the Republican provision goes through that cuts Medicaid reimbursement in order to provide tax breaks for wealthy people, Maine, as an example, one state, would lose 5,000 jobs. Kansas, 6,200 jobs. Iowa, 11,000 jobs. Missouri, 26,600 jobs. I've talked to the administrator of BJC in St. Louis, Missouri. The reason is it's not just a Missouri hospital. They have their facilities on the Illinois side of the river. In fact, 1/3 of their patients are from Illinois, and 1/3 of their patients overall use Medicaid to go to their hospital. So he's told me what's going to happen if the Republican measure goes through and the cutbacks to these hospitals. They came up with, incidentally, the rescue fund to solve the political problem. I want to check to make sure Senator Murray can back me up on this. Our overall cut in Medicaid now is at about $1 trillion. Correct. $1 trillion. Imagine, this is Washington, we talk in those terms. Cutting Medicaid nationwide $1 trillion. And the rescue plan for the small hospitals that are in danger, the ones I've talked about, $1 trillion cut. How big's the rescue plan? $25 billion. Do the math. It's a joke. It is a joke. If Republican leaders think this is an adequate amount to alleviate pain all of our nation's rural hospitals are going to feel, then that's like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. This simply won't work. I want to conclude by saying this. We passed the Affordable Care Act 15 years ago. Of all the things that I've worked on in Congress, I think it had more positive impact to help the families across America than anything. We found a way to make health insurance more affordable for families 15 years ago. And to do it, we held hearings, 100 hearings on the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare is what they called it. Roundtables, walkthroughs. 2 committees spent a combined 21 days holding markups so that everyone could offer an amendment. Do you know how many amendments were made to the Obamacare program? 400. 400 votes in committee and on the floor on amendments. 147 Republican amendments were included, though not a single Republican senator ended up supporting the Obamacare when it was all over. What do we have here with this measure? At the end of the day, that legislation, the Obamacare, allowed more than 40 million Americans to gain health insurance. Today, how many hearings have we had on the bill that's before us, this dramatic multi-trillion-dollar bill? None. 0. Not a single one. 0 markups for senators to offer amendments. 400 amendments on Obamacare. None on this one until it comes to the floor today. 0 bipartisan input. Our friends on the Republican side have said basically it's a big deal. Take it or leave it. Should this bill become law, do you know what we'll done? Thrown 16 million Americans off health insurance and closed many vulnerable small hospitals, all to pay for tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. Maybe some of my Republicans are okay with that. I don't think the American people are. I'm hoping that sanity and common sense prevail. We need 4. We need 4 senators to step up and say, stop this train. We've got to sit down and do our homework. We cannot expose the American families and the American economy to do this in the name of preserving tax breaks for the wealthiest people. Elon Musk seems to be doing okay in life, right? The wealthiest man in the world. Do you know what the tax break is for Elon Musk on the bill that's before us on the floor? $346,000, a lot of money. To him, he won't even notice it. Giving him a tax break, he won't notice, and taking away health insurance from families who will be devastated, 16 million around the country. It's an important choice, and it's one we should make the right one. I yield the floor.
President.
I recognize a senator from Kentucky.
In deciding whether to vote for the big, not-so-beautiful bill, I've asked a very specific question. Will the deficit be more or less next year? The answer, without question, is this bill will grow the deficit. The federal government has fancy formulas and hundreds of wonky accountants who inform us of their projections over 10 years. But you often can't trust these projections. In an excellent piece written by the Foundation for Economics and Education entitled "The CBO's Projections Are Worse Than Useless," Eric Schuler writes, "Long-term analysis and language is commonplace in U.S. national politics, but it achieves no useful outcome. It confuses far more than it clarifies. It does not provide accurate estimates of long-term results. It does not improve the average voter's understanding of policy effects. And it gives politicians a means to claim they are being fiscally responsible."
Honey, we've got to slow down with this online shopping. I mean, these boxes are everywhere. These are never going to fit in my car. What is that?
But we needed a bigger car. So I went to laurabuickgmc.com and I found the perfect vehicle at the right price. And they shipped it right to our front door. And they're the #1 volume Buick GMC dealer in the entire country. So they have a reputation that we can count on.
I thought we agreed to slow down the online shopping.
No, we said no more boxes. And that didn't come in a box.
At Laura Buick GMC, you can buy a new vehicle entirely online. Select your vehicle, financing options, trade-in, and even sign. And best of all, we deliver. Visit laurabuickgmc.com today.
The Congressional Budget Office miscalculated the deficit last year by $1 trillion. So in deciding whether to vote for any big, monstrous bill, it helps to ask the right question. To me, the most pertinent question is, how will the bill affect the deficit in the next year? Currently, our deficit is estimated to be a little under $2 trillion this year. What will happen to the debt in 2026 if this bill passes? Well, using the math most favorable to the supporters of the bill, referred to as the policy baseline, the deficit in 2026 will still be $270 billion more than this year. So even using the math, even using the formulas that the supporters of the bill like, the deficit will grow by $270 billion next year. That's just not good if you profess to be fiscally conservative. Why will the deficit grow next year? Well, even if you argue that the 2017 tax cuts don't need to be counted in the calculation at all, the new tax cuts add up to $234 billion to the debt next year. In addition, the big not-so-beautiful bill adds new spending of over $500 billion, military, border, agricultural subsidies, etc. That spending is front-loaded and will be spent in the first 4 years of the 10-year window. Legislated spending is one of the few items in the bill that is exact. It isn't estimated. If they say they'll spend $500 billion, they're going to spend $500 billion, all in the first few years. So in order not to add to the deficit, the BBB, the big not-so-beautiful bill, has to have corresponding spending cuts to counter all the new spending. Unfortunately, the spending cuts are backloaded to the final 5 years of the 10-year window when several tax cuts expire and the spending increases are finished. In addition, elections occur every 2 years and could easily wipe out any perceived savings that might occur in the later years. The only real certainty in this budget drama are the budget years coming in the immediate future. It's the next year or two are the only things that are actually of any certainty. So if we analyze this bill from that perspective, we discover that the bill increases the debt by $500 billion in the first 5 years. This is not the CBO projection that Republicans have not liked. This is the projection they are using, says the debt will add $500 billion in the first 5 years. Now, they say somehow, miraculously, in the last 5 years, it gets to a $500 billion in savings. So it's $1 trillion shift from year 5 to year 10. The CBO scores it differently, not as encouraging, and says it adds over $3 trillion in debt. So which is it? Does this bill save $500 billion over 10, or does it add $3 trillion over 10? The truth is that anybody, that even a person with a magic crystal ball, it's anybody's guess. Which brings us back to, maybe we have to judge the effects of the big, not-so-beautiful bill by looking at what happens to the debt next year. Supporters of the bill admit it adds $270 billion to the debt next year. That's the only thing we know for certain. We don't know what happens in year 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, but we know next year this bill will grow the deficit by $270 billion. In addition, the bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. What does that mean? That is an admission that they know they aren't controlling the deficit. They know that the ensuing years will add trillions more. So we're adding $2 trillion this year, but they're anticipating, the authors of the bill anticipating, adding more than $2 trillion next year. That doesn't sound at all conservative to me, and that's why I'm a no.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, joining me on the floor are experts in the budget process, former chairs and ranking members, Senator Murray, who's been Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 2015, Senator Whitehouse, who's Senate Budget Chair 2023 through 2025, Senator Van Hollen, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee in 2011 through 2017. We're here to address a fundamental violation of the law, of Law 313, Section 313, and it is the set of rules for reconciliation. To try to summarize this in the simplest words possible, 100 senators voted to have a special fast-track, filibuster-free pathway solely for reducing the debt. First principle was no deficits could be created in a 10-year period. My Republican colleagues blew that up in 1996 when they wanted to do a tax bill that would create massive deficits. Then, a second pillar was no deficits in any title of the bill in any year after the first 10 years. This bill right now, if this passes, that blows that up. And the third was use honest numbers, Congressional Budget Office numbers. I have a letter here from the Congressional Budget Office, and they say, the estimate is relative to CBO's January 2025 baseline. CBO is required to construct its baseline under the assumptions specified in the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act and the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. In response to your questions about the cost of Title VII, the question was, would Title VII increase the deficit by more than the $1.5 trillion over the 2025 through 34 period? The answer is yes. CBO estimates that enacting would increase the deficit by nearly $3.5 trillion over the 2025-2034 period. $3.5 trillion. We then asked, would it increase deficits in the years beyond 2034, beyond the 10-year window? The answer was yes. But if you ask my Republican friends, they say, no, no, no. We're inventing a new theory, and that is that anything that the 2017 tax giveaway to the billionaires put into the law that expired after 10 years, we're just going to assume it would have continued, and therefore us continuing it doesn't cost anything. That's a pretty crazy notion, that if they didn't put it into the bill, the law says it ends, but they say, no, no, it would have continued anyway through some magical way. So therefore, a tax break for the really wealthy costs nothing. This is exactly the type of lying to ourselves, smoke and mirrors that 100 senators agreed to end back in 1974. And that it has continued, that piece of it has continued in place for 51 years until this moment in this Senate by this Republican majority says we're going to start lying to ourselves and lying to the American people about what this bill costs. But we're not going to lie. We're going to tell you the truth. This bill costs well over $3 trillion over 10 years and some $30+ trillion on top of existing deficits and debt because of the provisions that are in this particular bill. Our current debt, national debt, that's been run up since the Declaration of Independence is around $36.5 trillion. This bill basically matches that in creating that much additional debt over the next 30 years. This is a huge assault on the programs that we can sustain as a nation for the people of America. People struggling to get on their feet, so we want affordable housing programs. We want to have fair and quality health care. We want to have an education system that gives every child the opportunity to thrive. We want to create a robust economy through investment so there are good jobs, because no government program is better than a good job. All those imperiled by this bill because the Republican leadership is lying to the American people and lying to ourselves. So we're here to tell the truth, and first of all, we're going to turn to Senator Murray, who, as I mentioned, was the Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 2015.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Washington State.
I thank the senator from Oregon and our other budget chairs, ranking members from previous years, because this is really important. Mr. President, there are some things you can't change with legislation. despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to believe. For example, 1 plus 1 is 2. And while $1 trillion might have a lot of zeros in it, it is, in fact, a much, much bigger number. Now, that might sound obvious, but apparently my colleagues across the aisle need a little reminder, because right now, Republicans are pretending not to get it. It is almost beyond belief, and it is certainly beyond common sense. After years of complaining about the debt, in fact, at the same time they're talking about how we need to address the debt, Republicans now are suddenly pretending they don't know how to count. Republicans are suddenly pretending the parliamentarian doesn't exist if they don't talk to her. Republicans are suddenly pretending that precedent doesn't exist if they just fake amnesia, and that norms and consequences for breaking them will disappear if they wish it away really hard. My preschool students had more common sense. Republicans should know if they replace math with magic, if they tear up the Senate process, if they blow off the Senate parliamentarian, that bill will come due. And not just the bill for $4 trillion blown on tax cuts for billionaires and corporations. The bill will also come due for trashing this Senate process and precedent when Republicans are no longer in the majority. Mr. President, if Republicans are serious about plowing forward with rewriting or ignoring Senate procedure and the laws of mathematics, I just ask, spare me the empty excuses. Spare me the explanations that totally ignore the reality of what you are doing. I mean, do they really think it washes away everything to say, oh, it's fine to break the process in half because we say it's fine? Oh, it's fine. We have the authority to ignore math. Give me a break. To every Republican who really thinks that is a convincing argument, to anyone who thinks we can is just an acceptable rationale for going nuclear and pretending the most expensive bill in the history of our country can be paid for by some magic bean counting, here is my challenge to you. Go back home and try that game with your constituents. Tell them, it's okay, yes, the debt's going to be $4 trillion, higher 10 years from now. That's true. But it's fine. We voted on it. And we get to say $1 trillion is actually 0. Go ahead. See how that works for you. And you may as well tell them you are voting against gravity next, because that's just as reasonable. And don't forget, when you tell your families back home that trillions of dollars in tax cuts for billionaires and companies are free because you waved a wand or you said some magic words, don't forget to tell them those are just tax cuts for the billionaires, not for working families. Don't forget to tell the folks back home, yeah, I voted to say $1 trillion is nothing, but we still need to kick people off of their health care. That's just too expensive. We still need to close those hospitals. We have to cut costs, and we still have to kick people off SNAP because the debt is out of control. And don't forget to mention that, no, we can't afford childcare. We can't afford paid family leave. We can't afford to solve your problems. Magic math is apparently just for billionaires. You all are getting less. Please, Republicans, send that message to your constituents. Just see how it goes over. Because you can fool yourself, but you are not going to fool the American people. They don't get to balance their budget with magic math. They don't get to pretend $1 trillion is nothing. And they don't get to pretend that this bill is free. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what policy baseline you all want to use in D.C., those families back home, they're the ones who will be paying the actual cost. I yield back to the Senator from Oregon.
I yield to a question.
I would.
In the time that you were budget chair, did you ever contemplate a situation in which you argued that renewing a tax break that was by law expiring would somehow have no impact on the deficit?
To my friend from Oregon, I never would have contemplated and I never would have put it forward. And I happen to know that if I had have suggested that my Republican colleagues would have been all over me telling me that breaks the rules.
Thank you very much. We're turning to Senator Whitehouse, who was Senate Budget Chair from 2023 to 2025.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. I mentioned earlier the history of the section that the Republican budget chairman is using to perform this multi-trillion-dollar magical act of making huge deficit-busting numbers disappear. It's called Section 312. It has been used before, but it has always been minor, corrective, and bipartisan. I mentioned earlier the adjustment that was made on a bipartisan basis to the Power Marketing Administration's numbers to return the CBO to an agreement that the Senate had previously made. That was not enormously consequential. This is almost certainly the first time you're hearing about it. Again, in 2023, as budget chair with Republican Chair Jody Arrington on the House side, we made a $105 million adjustment to a dairy program. Today we're talking about trillions. This was a $105 million adjustment. Again, bipartisan, minor, and corrective, fixing a technical issue on a bipartisan basis. Last year, Speaker Johnson and Leader Schumer agreed to direct CBO to score a fee program with an OMB estimate, and they used this rule again, collaborating on a bipartisan basis with a matter that was minor and corrective. Well, this is different. This is trillions. And Republicans are using this rule to pretend that it's not. Well, there are lots of ways to look at who's right. Time, obviously, will tell. But this bill actually has a tell right in it. Page 754 of this bill is the reality check on whether or not they're running up the debt by trillions. We know they're running up the debt by trillions because they say so in this bill. You can play Senate procedural fakery. You can wave magic wands around numbers all day long. But someday, soon, you hit reality. And you hit reality in the real world of markets and selling treasury bonds and having a legal debt limit. If this did not raise the debt by trillions, they would not need to raise the debt limit by trillions. Here is the text. Subtitle C, increase in debt limit. Section 72001, modification of limitation on the public debt. The limitation under Section 3101B of Title 31 is increased by $5 trillion. They're dodging the parliamentarians' ruling by letting the budget chair make a $1 trillion magic wand maneuver because they know pretty darn well what the parliamentarians' ruling would be. And how do they know what the parliamentarians' ruling would be? Because the answer's in their own damn bill. I yield the floor.
Would the senator from Rhode Island yield for a question?
Of course.
You mentioned the use of Section 312, which gives some flexibility to resolve, as you put it, minor issues on a bipartisan basis to correct an issue, a technical issue. In those cases you mentioned, were those on a reconciliation bill?
Were they on a reconciliation bill? I don't believe they were.
No, they were not.
They were
In fact, that power has never been used on a reconciliation bill because the following Section 313 gives very specific instructions. It says each provision must be costed out for its impact on both outlays, the spending side, or revenue, should it be a revenue measure. And if you're saying, well, how do I do that? You say, well, if we pass this provision, what will it cost as compared to not passing this provision, not having the bill? That's a comparison to current law. This ability of the budget chair, and actually the law says the budget committee, to correct technical issues on narrow issues on a bipartisan basis, basically solves snarly little budgeting questions like on the dairy program you mentioned, never used on reconciliation ever, never used on a broad basis ever, never used to create a lie about what a bill costs in this fashion. Now we're turning to a senator from Maryland, who was ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee for 6 years. So he brings a lot of experience and knowledge about the budget process. Senator Van Hollen.
Well, Mr. President, I thank my colleague and the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Merkley. I just want to start by reading a statement. This is a quote. Anyone that says current policy baseline is the right way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud. It's intellectually lazy. My basic mission in life is just to try to create some honest math, unquote. That wasn't from Senator Van Hollen or anyone on this floor. This was from a Republican member of the House, Congressman Schweikert from Arizona, talking about exactly the issue we're debating here in the United States Senate. Let me read you another quote, a little more colorful. Again, about this Republican accounting fraud. Quote, this is fairy dust, and they're just full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it. Republican Congressman Chip Roy of Texas. They're right. This is a fraud. This is a fraud that would make the Enron scammers blush. And I quote those House members for a reason, because we can disagree with what they did in their bill, and I strongly disagree with it. But at least they used honest math, and at least they used the math that is required by the rules here in the Senate. The honest math that Republicans here in the Senate want to dodge, because it will both tell the American people just how big the deficits are, but also because it will screw up their whole entire plan. Just so people listening have some sense of how these Senate numbers are designed to disguise the real impact of their deficits. Look at, for example, the basic individual tax rates in the House bill. When they extended those tax rates from the Trump 2017 bill, it costs $2.2 trillion. Under what we call the current law baseline, which is the reality baseline, because that's what it will cost when you understand that they sunset at the end of this year, and that's what it will cost to renew them. So under honest accounting, it's $2.2 trillion. Under the Senate fraudulent accounting, that $2.2 trillion deficit miraculously becomes an $83 billion deficit. Let's look at the House permanent extension of key deductions for businesses. That would cost honest accounting $821 billion. Under the Senate accounting scam, $6 billion.
Storm season is here, and across the Carolinas, we're strengthening our systems with innovative technology that can reroute power to help prevent outages. It's all part of building a smarter energy future for you.
And we all know that when the debt goes up and we have to put more of our costs on Uncle Sam's credit card, it puts upward pressure on interest rates. That means Americans will pay higher interest rates on their mortgages, on their car loans, and everything else. So when you try to hide the deficit impact, you really are trying to fool the American people, and we're here to blow the whistle. Now, I just want to show our colleagues something that was put together by the Committee for a Responsible Budget. And if you look at the blue, you can see for each year, starting this year, 2025, 2006, the blue is what Senate Republicans claim their bill will add to the deficit. The red is how much more it will actually add to the deficit. So at the end of this 10-year period, what you see is Senate Republicans are claiming that their bill will add $441 billion, which is still a big number, but the real number when you do honest accounting, when you add up all of these, it's $4.2 trillion, a much bigger number. Now, I do want to point something out on this chart. I think everybody watching should understand it. If you look at these orange parts, these are the additional deficits from tax cuts. Starting here in year 2029, 2030, you'll see that they actually do start going down. Why is that? It's because the tax cut that President Trump promised for no tax on tips, they phased those out. This is all just a make-believe ruse. Yeah, we start providing no tax on tips, but those disappear. The tax breaks for wealthy people, they go on. And they go on not just for this 10-year period, but the reason they violate all the rules of reconciliation is because they keep going on after that. And as Senator Merkley said, if you look at the entire history of the Byrd rule, that's Senator Byrd, it was designed to make sure that 51 senators through a vote could not make these kind of permanent changes in any area, but specifically they were worried about areas that increased the national deficit and debt. So what Republican senators are doing is not only misleading the American people, but they're violating the entire structure that carved out this special procedure that we call reconciliation for the budget, which was intended to lower deficits and debts, not have them go on forever. As Senator Merkley has pointed out, I think if you look over a 30-year period, we're talking about $35 trillion plus additional to the debt. And Republicans want to hide that from the American people. That is budget fraud, pure and simple, and it is a violation of the rules of the United States Senate. This whole special structure that was created not to blow bigger holes in the debt and deficits, but to actually try to constrain them. So shame on everybody who's part of this fraud on the American people. I yield back my time.
Would the senator from Maryland yield for a question?
I will.
I found it very interesting that you pointed out that these tax provisions for the middle class, no tax on tips, is phased out, and no tax on overtime is phased out. And what you're saying, I believe, is that when they put into this bill that a tax break is ending, they're saying that it doesn't cost any more in the following years.
So they are certainly saying that their current policy baseline that they want us to make believe about would say that this wouldn't cost them. In other words, if they extended this, it wouldn't cost anything. It is interesting to note, not only does that expose the fraud behind the current policy baseline, but they made a very deliberate choice. Even though they now say that they can make these tax cuts permanent and still comply with the rules, they decided to make the tax cuts for very rich people permanent. But even though they say it's not going to cost anything anymore to provide, tax cuts with no tax on tips, they're phasing those out. And all of these areas are where President Trump made promises that he was going to take care of some working people. Well, man, those go away fast. Tax cuts for the rich, they go on for not just the full 10 years, but they keep going, which is why this is a violation of the entire reconciliation process.
So I find two things very interesting. They're saying if something was in the law that they passed in 2017